Okay, hello. It is Wednesday, August 25th, 2021, and this is class three of our session called Ain on Lu, in which I am trying to bring Rabbi Lu's voice alive in this time of pandemic and transition in our world, and especially as we move into our second century here at Congregation Beth Shalom. We've been trying to bring Rabbi Lu's teachings with us. So today's topic is going to be suffering. I'm going to talk about suffering. Some of you who might be familiar with Buddhism or Buddhist teaching, you might imagine suffering. Rabbi Lu might have a lot to say about suffering. Class 4, which will be next Wednesday, the topic will be Teshuvah. Next week's topic will be Teshuvah. If you didn't have a chance to join us, last week's topic was spirituality and social justice. And 2 weeks ago, we just gave an overview on who Rabbi Lu was. So let me begin quickly because I do have a lot of material and I want to hear from Rabbi Lu. Let me just begin with an overview, a little YouTube clip so we can see him. And he is going to talk a little bit about suffering. And as always, just give me a nod if you are able to hear Rabbi Lu. Do you see Rabbi Lu? Great.
When we get to Judaism, the first thing we have to acknowledge is it is not the program of Judaism to ameliorate suffering the same way it is the program of Buddhism. If I were to stand on one foot and say what the program of Judaism was, I would say it is to realize the sacred in every moment. Now, that is not in any way contradictory to ameliorating suffering, because after all, if we realize the sacred in every moment, we are much less likely to either want to get out of that moment and into another one, and much less likely to suffer in it. Okay? So they're not contradictory in any way, as far as I can see. But on the other hand, let's not try to say that they're the same thing. I mean, Judaism is not the same thing as Buddhism. They have a very different point of emphasis. Nevertheless, it must also be said that Judaism is certainly not indifferent to the question of suffering, and often comes to very similar conclusions. For instance, what is the very first story that we tell ourselves? What is the very first story that we tell ourselves after we set up the scenery? There was heaven, there was earth.
Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. And what is the story of Adam and Eve? In many ways, it's like an illustrated version of the Four Noble Truths. It's a story of a man and a woman who had everything that they needed, but who wanted the one thing that they couldn't have, and that brought suffering and death into the world. It's a very similar story to the one that's told in the Four Noble Truths. The suffering that was brought into the world was a result of wishing things to be otherwise, wanting the one thing that they couldn't have. And there is this very important passage in the Talmud. It's towards the very beginning of the Talmud. It's in Masechet Brachot, on the 5th page of Masechet Brachot. Masechet Brachot is the first Masechet, the first tractate of the Talmud. And it doesn't go very far. It barely gets 5 pages when it immediately tackles the question of suffering. Why we suffer, and what we can do about it.
All right. So unfortunately, that's the end of the clip. And that's a noise that I want to stop. So hold on one second.
Thank you so
much to Verbo for setting this up and sponsoring this trip for us. Raul and I were actually thinking of doing some kind of baby moon where we just drive somewhere and get away. So I feel like this might be the baby moon. This past year, we obviously have not been able to travel because of the
We're going to return to our recording here now that we've stopped that. And so thankfully, the recording, the video stops right there. But I have, this is a teaching that Rabbi Lou has given a number of times. And I have, it comes from Brachot, but it also was one that was used in the sermon that he delivered after September 11th. And so I want to pull that up here so that we can see his retelling of it. At first, I was just going to take it from the page of Talmud. So here it is from the page of Talmud, but it's a little, do you see that? There it is from the page of Talmud. So, but I like Rabbi Lou's interpretation of it. So let me just go right to the sermon that he delivered on September, on the Rosh Hashanah following the attacks 20 years ago on September 11th. And so here it is. Let me just pull it over here. All right. Okay, so he says here, there is a wonderful story in the Talmud, which I've cited here many times, but which strikes me with particular force this year. It is the story of Rabbi Yochanan, who comes to give comfort to his dying colleague, Rabbi Eliezer. He sees that Rabbi Eliezer is crying and he asks him why, or rather he begins to theologize, to trot out one pat theory after another as to why Rabbi Eliezer might be crying and why he really shouldn't be crying after all. Are you crying because you didn't get to study enough Torah? Rabbi Yochanan asks. Don't worry. It doesn't matter how much you learned, only how sincere you were in your studies. No, that's not why I'm crying, Rabbi Eliezer says. Well, then, is it because you were always poor? Don't worry. You can't have everything in this life. And after all, you were a great scholar. No, that's not it either, Rabbi Eliezer says. Well, then it must be because you lost a child. Don't worry. This bone I wear around my neck is the bone of the 10th child I lost. So you really don't have it so bad, do you? No, Rabbi Elazar says, that's not it either. And then he cuts the ground right from beneath Rabbi Yochanan. I'm crying because of Kal Hai Shufra Debale Be'afra. I'm crying, he says, because of all this beauty which is fading into the earth. I'm crying because life is impermanent, evanescent, and everything keeps disappearing, and I don't have the slightest idea why. I'm not crying because of any of the reasons you suggest. I'm not comforted by any of your foolish explanations. I'm crying because I live in a dangerous world which I don't understand. I am crying because this is a world of great beauty which keeps disappearing on me, and I don't know why. Right, so that's the story from the Talmud. And yes, I can share all of these links. If anybody just wants to email me, either you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching now, just email me, rabbi.ain@beshalomsf.org, and I'll be happy to send you all of the links and all of the papers that I'm using here. So we have this really beautiful story about the nature of suffering and Rabbi Yochanan's desire to alleviate Rabbi Elazar's suffering. And so what I want to do now is Rabbi Lou launches into a 5-step program for how to grapple with suffering. And I have a large chunk of audio that I want to begin to dissect, because this was really the heart of his book, Be Still and Get Going. And it revolved around a piece of Torah that comes from the book of Exodus. All right, so if I can just open up Exodus here. All right, well, it comes from, you'll trust me, it comes from when the Jews are fleeing the people of Egypt. All right, so let's just go. I'm having some technical difficulties. I apologize, but we're going to go right into it now. And when I get the text, if you're interested in the verse, I will put it up there so that everyone can read along. So let's just pause here for a second. And Rabbi Lew is giving a speech here on leave taking and this idea that throughout all of the traditional faiths and religions, this idea of leave taking is archetypal. And that one of the things that meditation and spiritual practice does for us is it's in a sort of way a little bit of a leave taking. It's a leave taking from our world. It's a leave taking from the hustle and the bustle to pause and to get a sense of what is happening inside of us. And he says that gives us a smaller degree of the type of leave taking that we see. It's archetypal in the other faith traditions. So let's listen a little bit in here.
In virtually every religious tradition. Buddha, his famous home leaving, Buddha was the son of wealthy aristocrats, and like all people in the upper middle class and higher, they tried to protect their son from suffering. In fact, they tried to prevent him from ever seeing suffering. They kept him locked up in the house. But then he became a teenager, and like all good teenagers, he ran away from home. And he went out on the street, and he was absolutely devastated by the suffering he was seeing there for the first time. And so he left home, vowing never to return until he had solved the dilemma of human suffering. And Jesus went out into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights and struggled with the temptations. And Muhammad was driven out of Mecca. Yes, driven out of Mecca. And he had to run to Akhar Hamidbar, just like Moses, to the furthest reaches of the Arabian desert. In this case, oddly enough, to a Jewish city, Medina, at the northern edge of the Arabian Peninsula. So this is an absolutely consistent archetype. In every religion of the world, somebody takes leave, they encounter the transcendent, they come back, they tell everybody about it. That's how religions are born. A significant departure from this archetype is the Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, because here, everybody leaves, and everybody has the encounter with the transcendent at Mount Sinai. And from that moment forward, there's a reconfiguration of the idea of leave-taking in Jewish thought. Because it can no longer mean actually leaving. Because that becomes, the communitarian value becomes almost absolute. Al tifrotz min hatzibur. Don't leave the community under any circumstances. So leave-taking can no longer mean packing your bags and going to Philadelphia. It becomes internalized. And it comes to stand for the idea of leaving our ordinary consciousness, leaving our habitual relationship to our experience, and entering an extraordinary, concentrated, and focused state of mind. Hitbodedut. And actually, the idea of leave-taking was retranslated in each of the traditions that I mentioned earlier in very similar ways. It was internalized. What had become... because you think about it, if you just keep physically leaving, if you do serial leave taking, you're just an escapist. But we're talking about leaving to become exactly who we are and to experience our lives in a very precise way.
Okay, so Rabbi Lew there is talking about the suffering that the Buddha experienced, that he had been sheltered from, and the need to take his own leave-taking, the experience of Jesus, the experience of Abraham, the experience of Muhammad. There's the suffering that exists in this world and a spiritual archetype. We take a leave from this world and we have this revelatory experience. The Jewish story is a little bit different because it's a community that has this revelatory experience. And then he says, what do we do about suffering? Well, we can meditate, and in a little way that can help sensitize us to the suffering that exists in the world. All right, so now he's going to say that there is a 5-step program that is going to be given to us right here when the Israelites are leaving the land. Now, can you see my screen while I'm doing the audio? If I do the audio, can you see my screen? What do you see? You just see the thing. All right, so here it is. So let me just give you this link. So if you want to follow along with him, he is going to be using these verbs here. Hold on. Basically, this verse here, 14:13. And I'm going to put that in the chat here so that you can follow along with what he is going to share now, because he says that out of these verses here, the leave taking that the Israelites do from the land of Egypt and the lessons given by Moses at the leave taking, this is the 5-step program that we can apply today in our lives. And let's give a listen to it.
With intractable suffering, for dealing with that kind of moment I was speaking about earlier, for dealing with that moment where you know you have to do something and you have absolutely no idea what to do. You know, that moment when Pharaoh's army is coming at you from behind and there's nothing but the sea in front of you. And a 5-step program is very good. It's very economical. You know? It's 5 less than the 10 Commandments. It seems, at first blush to be 1 more than the 4 Noble Truths, but the 4th Noble Truth is the 8-fold Noble Path. So we're way ahead of the game. But it's really striking, because what we find here at the precise moment of leave taking is 5 very strong verbs, almost one after another. 4 uttered by Moses and 1 uttered by God. It's a collaboration. And it's just, you all know this scene, because depending on how old you are, you saw either the Cecil B. DeMille or the Steven Spielberg version of this story. So I don't have to give you too much background. But, the children of Israel leave, and then the Pharaoh thinks better about it, so he sends out his chariots after the Israelites. 600 of his choicest chariots with 3 armed soldiers in each chariot. Pretty scary. That's at least 1,800 armed Egyptians. And they go out, and the Israelites look up, and they see these Egyptians coming, and one of them, an unidentified Israelite, but I can tell you he was the karmic ancestor of Henny Youngman, because this is like a real Borscht Belt line. He says, "What's the matter? They didn't have enough graves in Egypt? You had to take us out here in the desert to die?" This is what he says, quite literally. And this is when Moses and God respond with these 5 verbs. And it's a very interesting program. First, Moses says, "Al tira'u," which means don't be afraid. It doesn't really mean don't be afraid. If you're afraid, you're afraid. I used to have an uncle who used to say, if you're scared, say scared. And that is a point of view that has held up very well for me all my life. So it doesn't mean pretend you're not afraid or try to make yourself not be afraid. What it means, and particularly in this context, you can see is stop running around in a panic about things that aren't real. Al tira'u. Rebbe Nachman said that suffering is being afraid of things that we don't need to be afraid of, being afraid of things that we only imagine are going to harm us or threaten us. And this covers 99% of the things that we're afraid of. And this fear controls our life, this fear of phantoms. And we see this here in this scene. I just gave you a mathematical breakdown of the military force that the Pharaoh sent after the Israelites. 1,800 men. Wow. There were 2 million Israelites, and and the Torah is very careful to point out they were also armed. So why were 2 million Israelites so frightened of 1,800 Egyptians? Never mind, they had very nice chariots. All right, I'll grant you that. Rashi points out an anomaly in the text that's really interesting. In verse 9, it says, V'yirdefu hamitzrim achareichem. The Egyptians chased after them. Both subject and verb in the plural. A half a verse later, it says, Umitzrayim nosea achareichem. And Egypt came after them. So one half of a sentence later, now the verb and the subject are in the singular. What does this mean? Rashi, with his usual pithy brilliance, has a 2-word commentary to explain this anomaly. That the second time describes what the Israelites saw. The first time describes what happened objectively. The second time describes what the Israelites saw. And the Israelites saw a singular. Sar Mitzrayim. The spirit of Egypt. Their idea of Egypt. Not what was really there, but their idea. An idea that had been formed in 400 years of slavery. So this Henny Youngman character, he wasn't seeing what was there. He was seeing what was in his imagination, and it terrified him. What was there was 1,800 lousy Egyptians.
So from this verse here, Rabbi Lew is picking out sort of, this is the ultimate moment here of terror, of fear, of suffering. Here, you're going to let us die out in the wilderness. And he begins, I just want to point this out for those who might not be able to see it, al tira'u, that is the first verb there, which Rabbi Lew and is translated as have no fear, do not be afraid. So the first step in his 5-step program, what do you do when you're about to be crushed by 18,000 chariots, which he likes to say is probably not a lot of chariots if you take in mind the perspective of the fact that there were 2 million Israelites. Okay, so the first thing is do not be afraid. And the idea here is, what do? We find ourselves in a moment of suffering. Can we get perspective on our fear? Can we not be running around chasing the phantoms in our lives? Just want to pause here. And does anybody resonate with this? Does anybody have any comments that they'd like to share about this notion of fear or being scared or of chasing phantoms? Yeah, Sandy, go right ahead.
Well, it reminds me of the pandemic that we're under and fearing that we're going to get COVID, even though we're taking all these precautions. But I don't see that necessarily as not real. But different people see it different ways because they interpret the
I think that's exactly right. And I think that's his.
And for me, it's real, though.
Right. For you, it's real. Right. And I think for him, he's saying that different people will view the facts on the ground differently.
Right.
So some people will say there are only 18,000 chariots coming after us. We're 2 million people. What's the problem? Other people will say there are 18,000 Egyptian chariots coming after us. What's your problem? And I think it's all about what is going to be the perspective. I don't see Rabbi Lew giving value judgment here. I think he's explaining the process of how do we begin to cope internally with this sense of fear. And I think what he's trying to say is the first thing to do is just try not to be afraid. Try to understand what, my wife and I, Alana's here, and sometimes, she'll be worried about, is there going to be an earthquake tomorrow? Or is there, and we'll have whatever it might be. And I'll say to her, well, that's an irrational fear. And so I guess what Rabbi Lew wants us to do first here is to shake out getting fear of COVID, being in a space where that risk is high, legitimate fear, getting worried about whatever attenuated thing, blah, 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 blah. I'm not even going to get into it. Perhaps not a rational fear. And so Rabbi Lew wants to begin with us making that distinction. But I'll take other comments here, other thoughts here. Does anybody else want to chime in? Andrea, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I'm having a moment here. My wife recently passed, and she studied with Rabbi Lew.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Thank you. And about 4 years ago, she was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma, and she talked about not falling into being afraid of what was to come, but she talked about staying in where we were presently with the information that we had, and to try not to go down the road and imagine, right? And I feel like this is exactly what she was talking about. Exactly what she was talking about.
Yeah, and and that imagination can take us away.
And you're no longer in the moment. You lose the moment you're in. You lose that present moment, right? If you spend your time spinning out
in the hypothetical. That's right. Once people have been saying, I was really scared about coming back to shul, but then I got to shul, it's not so scary. So I don't want to, that's just everyone giving their impressions, but I just think, Andrea, what you're saying is right. It's when it's the hypothetical as opposed to the tangible. It's the hypothetical other person who's unvaccinated, who's not following the rules, yada, yada, as opposed to the real life human being who's in front of you can lead to an increase of fear and concern. Okay. Other thoughts? All right, so that's the first step is al tireu, and let's go back now and let's take a look at the text because I want to give you the next verb before he gets into it, and it is going to be hit yatzvu, okay? And you might recognize that verb from a parsha, Nitzavim. And he is going to explain that. So the first way, how do we grapple with suffering as Jews? We try to follow God's advice not to be afraid. All right, so let's go back to Rabbi Lew.
Al tira'u. And it's a very real step. And I hope that this week you become aware of some of the terrors that hold you in their thrall without your realizing it. Some of the phantoms, some of the Sar Mitzrayims, some of the ideas of Egypt that are limiting your life. It's a very valuable thing to see. But when we see it, the second step, and the second word, the very next word in the Torah that Moses utters is hityatzvu. Hityatzvu. Very beautiful words. It's from the shortish netzav, Parsha Netzavim. It means to stand, but not in the way that a human being stands erect. It means more to make a stand, to take a position. It's etymologically from a Ugaritic word for building, for construction, for gathering materials together, for concentrating materials in a single place. To construct something, it corresponds to the in-breath. It corresponds to the gathering in of the tzitzit that Jeff was talking about. It corresponds to that sense of gathering, of bringing ourselves to the center of our being, of focusing that we experience in meditation. So, hityatzvu, be with your fear. Stop running around in a panic. Stop trying to get away from your fear, but pull yourself together and stand with it. Stand still and see. Stand still and let reality come into focus. Let it arise as it is, as opposed to the rage for action with which we usually deal with feelings of fear. I'm afraid I'm going to do something about it. As I mentioned in the instructions for meditation,
All right, so I want to pause right there. All right. Hityatzfu, the second thing, do not be afraid when you are in a situation, when you have, there's some suffering coming, there's some anxiety, there's some worry. How do you get out? How do you grapple with that? Okay, Rabbi Lou's 5 steps. First step is do not be afraid, don't panic. The second step is stand your ground, stand your ground. Yatzvu. Any thoughts? Anybody have any comments on that? Be with your fear, right? I see somebody in the chat put fear of COVID. How do we be with that fear? Let's try. It's scary. So I just want to acknowledge that this is scary, but we're trying to learn from Rabbi Lou. How do we be with our fear? I mean, I really resonate this idea. We need to do something. We need to do something about this, and we need to do something right now. Okay, so Rabbi Lou wants to caution us at this moment. He's not going to say, trust me, the 5th part, he'll get to action, right? The book is called Be Still and Get Going, but he wants us to go through the 5 steps first. The first step, don't be afraid. The second step is stand your ground, be with your fear, as opposed to a rage for action. He says, this is try not moving. All right. Perhaps in a note, I just got the fight or flight impulse. How can you sort of outdo that flight or fight impulse? Okay, so suffering is coming upon you. We have fear of COVID. How do we grapple with that fear? Probably running around in a tizzy, trying to solve things. Not great, but how do we stand in our spot? Any thoughts? Yeah, Ben, go right ahead.
Well, I think it depends what kind of situation you're looking at. I mean, there are I think there are different responses that are appropriate for different kinds of situations, right? There are some situations which are chaotic, in which maybe you have to act. They're pretty rare, right? I mean, if your couch bursts into flame, you have to act, right? But there are situations that are just emergent, right? I mean, I think most situations that involve human beings are emergent. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what's going to work if you were to try something, right? And in those situations, often, you need to have some sensitivity. You need to understand sort of what's going on. And then sometimes you have to try gently something and then see what happens, and then continue to adjust. So, I think it depends what kind of a situation. And I think a lot of our problems when we do the wrong thing is because we don't understand what kind of situation we're in. And we behave as if it were one kind of situation when it's really another.
Beautiful. So let's go to the third verb here, which is uru.
This morning, this is why we try not to move.
Uru, Ben, translates as and to see. So exactly Ben's advice. Here's what Rabbi Lou says.
In meditation, we're looking for a different kind of answer. We're looking for a hityatzvu kind of answer. Not, okay, I'm afraid my knee is going to fall off if I stay in this position 1 second longer. So I'm going to take action.
I just want to pause here and explain to what Rabbi Lou is doing here. He's explaining what we experience in meditation, which is why a lot of us hate meditation, which is we sit down and we meditate. And he says it's no comparison to the suffering in the world. It's a microcosm of the sufferings in the world. But when you sit down and meditate, your knee hurts, something hurts, you're uncomfortable, you want to do something about something, you want to rush off and fix something, you forgot to turn off the oven, you have to go out and do it at that moment. And meditation, Rabbi Lou says, forces you to sort of, at a small extent, to hityatzvu here. Just wanted to give you the context.
Move. But hityatzvu, what would happen if I stood that fear down? Standing still is the leave-taking that leads to the divine encounter. The essential act of leave-taking is a turn towards stillness. And the third step, the very next word that's uttered after that, these words come one after another, is uru. Al tira'u, stop running around in a panic. Hityatzvu, collect ourselves. Make ourselves still. Uru, and see. And then we see what's really there, and not that phantom that we imagine to be there. This is the consequence of leave-taking. We see what's there instead of the phantoms that used to hold us in their thrall. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. That's a word that occurs 3 times in Tanakh, twice in Psalms and once in the book of Job. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. It's morning. You're not really going to die because you quit law school. Your knee is not really going to fall off because it hurts. There's a wonderful story in the book of Kings. It's the Haftorah that we read with Parsha Mitzorah every year, the one about leprosy. And it's about 4 lepers. And then they're in the town of Shumran. And the town of Shumran is under siege. Excuse me, they're not in the town because they're lepers. They're outside of the town because that's what happened when you were a leper. They put you outside. They forced you to take leave. And the town of Shumran was under siege by the Arameans. And the siege got really bad, and it's one of those scenes like you read in Jeremiah and in Lamentations, where people are eating. Well, never mind. They're really horrifying scenes. Because everybody's really starving, and so they stop. Of course, they stop putting food out for the lepers as they used to do, and so the lepers start to starve. So the lepers say to each other, "Well, look, it can't get any worse than this. Let's go into the Aramean camp and ask them for food. The worst they can do is kill us. We're going to die anyway, so who cares?" So they go into the Aramean camp. There's nobody there. And from the looks of things, there hasn't been anybody there for a long time. The city of Shumran has been held under siege by a phantom, by something that isn't there. And it took the outsiders. This is kind of a paradigm. The vision of the outsiders, the visions of the ones who have taken leave, to see what's really there. It takes that sense of having nothing left to lose.
So I'm going to pause here and give you a little bit of my interpretation here, because I really love this. And it's really the heart of a lot of how I've understood religion, and in particular this, which is that I once had the privilege of interviewing a gentleman who was a professor who ran the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. And he said what Judaism does best is what Freud would call optimal marginality, in that we have one foot firmly planted in the world as it is, and one foot firmly planted in Judaism. And as a result of that, we can take the best of what we get in our secular world and apply it into our Jewish realm, and we can take the best of what is in our Jewish realm and apply it to our secular. Without being fully ensconced in any one of these 2 realms, we have the optimal marginality that we can take the best from both and bring it back and forward. Okay, so what he is saying here, and which I have always understood, is if you're in a moment of crisis as an individual or as a person, right? What do the Jews need to do? What do the Israelites need to do? They need to take a Chag Ladonai. They need to go out of their slavery and have a 3-day festival, a Woodstock, to reconnect with who they want to be, to reconnect what the real values are, leave taking from the crazy mishigas of the world as it exists, to pause, to be still, to see what's important, to see what's going on, to have a chance of revelation, and then to come bring that in. And what I think Judaism, what I think Congregation Beth Shalom, what I think the Amim Noraim do is provide a necessary opportunity for leave-taking in a world that increasingly does not want us to take leave from it. And so I really resonate here with this teaching of these 4 lepers. It is those who are marginalized, who are outside of society, who have the perspective, like our prophets, to perhaps see through some of the illusions and some of the phantoms that, by virtue of the fact that we're ensconced in this Platonic cave, we cannot see beyond. All right, that's my little thought there. Any commentary, any thought on the first 3 steps so far? Step 1 is don't be afraid. Step 2 is stand your ground. Step 3 is go take a look around and see what is actually going on. Thoughts? Ideas? Yeah, Andrea.
Well, I think it goes back to, so here we are in the midst of a pandemic, where if we pay attention to the actual medical information, the actual studies, we can get the information that will feed the action we can take, as opposed to not necessarily paying as much attention to it and then making decisions that are based on the phantom, right? That's what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like constantly 24 hours, 7 days a week, getting that information. You know what I'm saying? And that's sort of that also being an unhealthy thing. Like, okay, I need the information. I need to know how to be safe in this world, but you know, I could use a little distance from it from time to time. Jeff.
Oh, no, I was just going to comment on something from earlier that I'll say it at the end if I say it at all.
Okay,
Sorry.
that's all right. Other thoughts? Miriam, did you want to say something? Okay. All right, so it's hard to do. All right, this is hard work, Rabbi Lou. This is not supposed to be easy. Okay, so yeah, I commented earlier. People don't like meditation. Yeah, well, I know a lot of people who've come and sat in meditation with us and told me they don't like it afterwards. It's hard. It's hard to sit still. It's hard to sit with those thoughts bubbling up. It's hard to have those pains and not doing something about it. And Rabbi Lou is teaching this practice so that we can make ourselves accustomed to recognizing what is happening inside of us so that we can pay attention to the way in which, whether our fear moves us, our reactive nature moves us, or what that might be. Judah.
I just appreciated your remarks about the marginalized viewpoint as somebody who's been marginalized their whole life. And, you know, I do have a unique perspective on things a lot of times, and I never looked at it, you know, because I am marginalized. And so that gives me something to think about. Thank you.
Amen. And that's where our greatest teachings come from. By virtue of having been marginalized in your past, Judah, you can see the flaws and the in our structure in a ways that people who grew up in it perhaps cannot, because it works for them. But for the marginalized and for the outsider, they feel the pain of those rough edges. Ben.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I gotta bring this in because I something sparked. I was just before this. I was reading this article in the New York Times about. I was just skimming it about Michaela Cole. I don't know if people are familiar with her. She's a British Black writer, actress. She did, I guess, Bubblegum and I Will Destroy You, I think, these TV series. Anyway, she wrote a book about how she's been, you know, very much on the margins of the entertainment industry and the way she's been treated. And the book is called Misfits. And I was just looking at a picture of her before I joined, and the caption is a quote from her: "A misfit doesn't climb in pursuit of safety or profit. She climbs to tell stories."
Oh, I love that. Oh, that resonates with me. Thank you, Ben. Very beautiful. And I think that, you know, I think if we're living in San Francisco, if we've moved to San Francisco, if we have a shul in San Francisco, we have a sense of what it means to be an outsider, and we seek to bring those outside perspectives in because we understand that enrich the entire community. It's beautiful. All right, so let's go on. Let's now look at the fourth verb. All right, so let me just point out the fourth verb here. All right, so we've got this, have no fear. Right, so we have al tira'u, hityatzvu, okay. And then he's going to go down here and skip again to tach rishun. Okay, tach rishun, hold your peace. All right, let me go back to Rabbi Lou now.
And then the next step is Tacharishun, which also means be still. Well, you just told me be still 2 words ago. No, this is the stillness that comes as a consequence. The first stillness was something that we do. We make ourselves still. And then we see what's really there. And this is a really beautiful thing, and I think you'll find it's true. When we start to see the things that we spend our whole life energy denying, when we finally see them, there's a tremendous sense of relief. We've been so terrified of these things all our life that really a good part of our life energy goes into pretending that they're not there. But when we do see them, we feel calm. When we really see the truth, when we really acknowledge the truth, we feel this tremendous sense of calm. It feels good, even if the truth is something awful. Even if the truth is something we might very well have been afraid to look at. It's still the truth, and it has the quality to calm us. So this Tachari, I remember last year.
All right, be still. And as Rabbi Lou teaches, sometimes when I'm counseling people, sometimes just acknowledging how bad things are is very healthy. Just speaking to the situation, not pretending things are not. Someone will call me up and say, I got into a car crash, I broke my leg, blah, blah, blah. I go, that sucks. And they'll just exhale because I said that sucks. So it's just acknowledging how awful things are. So this high holidays thing sucks with COVID, by the way, FYI, like it just does. Let's just acknowledge that. Maybe if we can begin to acknowledge that and pretend it doesn't, stop pretending it doesn't. We acknowledge it's all unfortunate. We're all sad about it. And it's hard. And if we can acknowledge that it's hard, and if we can acknowledge that we're separated from each other, it can make that a little bit less awful. And Rabbi Luke gives an example. I cut this out a little bit. I don't want to go a full 2 minutes with his stories, but he's got a story very close to my heart here, which is all about how much he hates airline travel and how to be still in the midst of airline travel. So we'll pick up in the midst of this story here.
Greek. And I was feeling so wonderful. And of course, an airport can really kick that out of you, And this was at Newark, and there was absolute chaos. There had been some rainstorms. A lot of flights had been canceled. There was a line that went 3 times around the airport at the Delta counter where I had to go to learn that my flight had been canceled. And they spent 45 minutes serving 2 people. And the line didn't move for 45 minutes. And it was a very long line. And meanwhile, every minute that we stand there, people are missing planes. And I have what Sigmund Freud calls anxiety at the train station. This is just the kind of thing that makes me crazy, And I was standing in line, and this terrible anxiety would rise up, and I would say, this is extremely unpleasant. And this wonderful calm would come over me, and I kept doing it like I had to do it every second. This is really unpleasant. You thought that was unpleasant. But it was just remarkable just to say that, just to see the truth. There's some wonderful calm that comes. So now here comes.
So that's the first 4, and let me just open up the text so you can see the verse that he is taking it from here. All right, so we have these 4 verses, these 5 steps. First, we have al tira'u, don't be afraid. So we're in the middle of a pandemic. Okay, don't be afraid. That's really hard. Hityatzvu, stand your ground. Stand your ground. Don't run around. Don't panic. Uru, and pay attention. Pay attention to what's real and what's a phantom, what's rational, what's not rational. And tach rishun, right? Tach rishun, be still. Be still and acknowledge the truth of the reality around us. And that can give a little bit of an alleviation. Try to hold your peace in the midst of all of this. Okay, so the next verse, if you'll see here, Vayomer Adonai El Moshe. Now God replies, and what does God say? What are you doing with these 4 steps? Go forward, okay? Vayisa'u. That's going to be the 5th verse, right? Be still and get going was the name of his book. So be still. And now God, after the 4 verbs from Moses, we're going to get the 5th verb from God to get going. All right.
Best part to me. And this is, of course, it would be the best part because it's the part that's uttered by God. The last part. What does God say? We said, Al tira'u, stop running around in the panic. Kityatzvu, be still, gather yourself, uru, and see what's really there instead of that phantom you were running away from. V'tacharishun, and once you see what's really there, this stillness will come over you. So what does God say? Yisau, get going. Is God trying to imply that Moses, his servant and prophet, is an idiot? Moses just told us not once, not twice, no, excuse me, twice, to be still, and God says get going. But there's no contradiction here. I mean, this is to me the best part. And it's an answer that comes out of that stillness, that comes out of tacharishu, that comes out of that emptiness. This get going is not something that we create. This get going is not a product of the ego. This get going is not something that we figure out by making lists, pros and cons. But it's something that comes to us. It's the action which flows out of this leave-taking, this stillness, this concentration. It's what they call in Taoism Wu Wei, non-doing. You know? Back in the 60s, when my friends and I encountered the idea of Wu Wei, we thought, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Non-doing, a religious and theological justification for the way that we live. You know? And it was one of the crushing disappointments of my young life when I discovered that it really didn't mean not doing anything. Except, listening to the Beatles. It meant acting without a sense of being the actor. Acting without ego. Allowing the next inevitable action to arise. Perfect alignment with what's happening. The action which arises seamlessly out of the moment. It's a wonderful passage. In Pirkei Avot, they ask all the rabbis, what's the most important quality to have? And one says a good heart, and of course, how could you be wrong with that answer? And another says, a good mind, and etc. They all have different answers. But my favorite answer is Haroe et Hanolad, the one who sees what is being born, the one who is so in tune with the moment that he sees the future arising out of it, that she senses the next action that the moment demands. God will fight for you, and you will be quiet, non-doing, just doing what must be done next. So this is really fascinating to me. This theme is so important in the Torah, in meditation, in Shabbat, in retreats, this moment of leave-taking. And this is what we see when the rubber hits the road. This is the moment of leave-taking life pushes us to. This is the moment of leave-taking meditation pushes us to. The moment when we realize that we just can't go on the way we've been going. When we feel that we have to do something and we have no idea what to do or even how to endure the next moment. And this, according to the Torah, is what we should do. 5 easy steps. Al tira'u. Stop running around in a panic. Stop trying to get away from phantoms. Stop trying to get away from fears that don't exist, from stories that we've been telling ourselves. Kityatzvu. Gather ourselves and be with the moment, fearful or not. Uru. And as a consequence of this stillness that we've brought ourselves to, seeing what's really there, Tacharishun, and then feeling the calm and the stillness that comes very deeply from seeing the truth, B'Yisau, and taking the next inevitable action that arises of its own accord out of the stillness, out of the emptiness. But let me reduce it even further. Let me reduce it to 2 steps. Be still and get going. God will fight for you. The universe will conspire to show you the next step that you have to take, if you'll just be still. Thank you. Shalom.
You're done.
Yeah, first of all, the brilliance of Rabbi Lew amazes me. I studied with him a little bit years ago, and I heard him one way then, and how I hear him now is, of course, totally different. And his brilliance is like, I didn't get it then, but I'm getting it now. So, and then 10 years from now, I'll get it even more. 2 things. One, there is meditation that is less grueling than the kind of meditation that he's talking about. So I think people have this meditation. If your foot starts hurting, you got to sit there and endure it. There are many other very powerful forms of meditation where if your foot hurts, you can just massage it or move it.
Maybe that'll be my contribution to Beth Shalom.
Yeah, there's not much fear. Find a meditation that works. You don't have to sit down there and be in pain. That's okay. The other thing, the main thing, I was thinking this thing about leave taking, which is beautiful. Since I personally believe God runs everything, okay, on some level. Could COVID be a forced leave taking because we were so caught up in the world and so out there and you know, that COVID made us come in to do a leave taking. And maybe we don't get out of COVID ever healthfully if we don't learn that we each have to take that leave taking and not just complain or just try to get back out. Seems to be the movement. We're just trying to get back out, get back to normal, get back to normal. Maybe God said, wait a minute, your normal is, you've got to step back. Your normal isn't working. This isn't the way I want.
Your normal is unhealthy. I mean, I think that's hard to hear in this context. I think it's maybe easier to hear in the context of climate change. I don't know why climate change would make it any easier to hear, but somehow it is like, you know, we need to, there are wildfires going on in our world, and we need to take a step back and ask, why is this happening? Why is this going on in our climate? What we're doing contributing to that? But it's always hard and it's always dangerous to try to take any real world situations and impose any theological sort of meaning to it, because you end up, I don't know, you almost end up speaking from your own particular standpoint. So it's hard to do, Don, but I enjoy the Midrash as much as anybody else does. And I do think the challenge is to see God moving in our world. But I don't know as a rabbi what I can tell you is going on with why we have COVID or not. I think I would be reluctant to do that. But I think if it can present us an opportunity to grow and to take leave from an unhealthy life. I mean, 20 years ago, I was an attorney. You know, I was an attorney in August of 2001, you know, and then 2 weeks later, 9/11 happened, and I took a leave taking from my life a little bit and decided I want to become a rabbi. You know, I was on a path because the Long Island Jewish kid who goes to law school in Brandeis, you know, the whole nine. And then 9/11 happened, and the universe did a leave taking. And I had a moment early on in my life where I decided the path that I wanted to be on. So I wouldn't ever say that it was a positive thing, but it was a thing. Other thoughts, other comments here. All right, I have, yeah, go Jeff, go right ahead.
Well, what I was going to say earlier was, you know, I'm one of the last of the old perennialists, and yet the analogs that Rabbi Lew was trying to draw in the beginning between Judaism and Buddhism and other religions, I thought were stretches at best. That's it. I have nothing more helpful to contribute than that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what we rabbis do. We like to stretch. We like to stretch so that things fit. It's a homiletical approach that we help to sort of lubricate messages in order to help them go down a little bit. And so what I want to do is let's go back to the sermon the 9/11 sermon. And actually, I didn't anticipate telling you my own sort of experience, but now it's appropriate, I guess, that we conclude with the 9/11 sermon here that Rabbi Lou gave in the week following. So here it is here. All right, Rabbi, so what do we do? And especially, what do we do with these feelings of despair and rage and impotence? All right, this is the week after the attacks. So he says, I think there's an answer to these questions suggested by the ending of that story from the Talmud I started to tell you before. After Rabbi Elazar finally tells the Nudnik, Rabbi Yochanan, why he is weeping, that he is weeping, the Kol Hai Shufra, the Balei, Bafra, for all of this beauty which is fading away. Rabbi Yochanan finally gets it right. He tells Rabbi Elazar, well, if that's why you're weeping, then of course you should weep. In fact, I'll weep with you. Then the two of them weep together. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Ten li yadcha, give me your hand. And Rabbi Elazar gives him his hand and he is healed, the Talmud tells us. Rabbi Lou goes on, when we acknowledge our impotence, when we acknowledge what we can't control, when we acknowledge that we really do live in a threatening world, which is always disappearing on us, when we acknowledge that we cannot reduce life and death to a pat explanation that gives us the illusion that we are in control of it, when we are, in short, flush with the truth, then we can, in fact, be comforted by the greatest source of healing there is, the simple presence of another human being. Rabbi Yochanan said, Ten li yadcha, give me your hand. He gave him his hand and he was healed. And if you wanted to have a little bit more suffering this morning, I'm going to read you the next paragraph. Coming here in such large numbers, we feel the healing power of the human presence, of being in community ourselves. And the more we are stupefied by events, the more they exceed our capacity to control them, the more this is true. The more we are able to give each other a communal space in which we can feel these difficult things we are feeling without having to act on them, the more that this is true as well. And so especially in our predicament here, when we cannot fully be together, we find ourselves in, without question, a challenging predicament. Okay, so any final words or anybody want to give any takeaways that they might have from Rabbi Lou's teaching? Hard teaching, you know, I was listening to this and preparing for this and thinking about COVID and thinking about all of the different fears and the worries and that, you know, to go through these 5 steps, to pull back from our hubris, our we can fix it, we can do it, and be still so that God can reveal God's answer to us is very hard in moments like this. And so I hope that we can hear Rabbi Lou's teaching from many years ago and find a way to make it real for us in our lives. Miriam.
Yeah, it's just a story. It would have been almost 24, 30 years ago. I lost a family member, so I came into mornings to sit there and daven. And so the first time I went in there, the place is dark and it's small. And I went to sit way in the back. And all of a sudden, the front row is always with, as we would say, out the carcass, right? The old men. And they came running to me saying, shoo, 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 you can't sit there. That's where the rabbi sits. And at that moment, Rabbi Lou comes and says, leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? I need her to sit next to me. That was Rabbi Lou.
Thank you, Miriam. And that, you know, that is so beautiful to share. And let's just, that presence of Rabbi Lou needing to sit next to you and you needing Rabbi Lou to sit next to you, to be there. That's the human presence. That's the healing, most healing thing of all that we all hope and look forward to getting back to. And so thank you, Miriam, for that beautiful story. Next week's class, we're going to talk about teshuvah. All right, so repentance. What does Rabbi Lou, you know he has some things to say about teshuvah. For those longtime Beth Shalomers, you heard him preach about teshuvah probably every year. So we're going to talk about how Rabbi Lou understands teshuvah. Now that we've talked about how can we get through this Elul, how can we begin to sort of take some stock with the things that are bubbling up? How can we now repent turn of our ways and reconnect with each other, with the community, and with God. So I look forward to seeing you all next week, and take care.
Yes, Shrikant, thank you.
Ruchti,